I had not planned to return to Madison that weekend. My mother had called 2 days earlier with the news that my father was under the weather, and though I had learned long ago not to accept every one of her statements without question, I still packed a bag and made the drive from Milwaukee. The house stood at the edge of the historic district, its white columns and wide porch exactly as they had been for decades. I used the key I kept on my ring and stepped inside without knocking. From the sitting room just off the foyer I heard voices. They were quiet. My mother and my sister spoke in the low, even tones they used when they thought they were alone. I set my suitcase down and stayed where I was. My mother said the word appearances twice. My sister answered with a short sound that was not quite a laugh. I caught only fragments, but the shape of it was clear. They were speaking about money that belonged to more than just the two of them and how to keep certain records from drawing attention. My sister's voice stayed light. My mother's stayed flat. I cleared my throat before I walked in. The conversation ended at once. My mother turned in her chair. She wore the same closed expression she always wore when caught mid-discussion. My sister kept her eyes on the papers for another second before she looked up. Neither of them smiled. "Amelia," my mother said. "You made good time." I nodded once. Traffic was light. My sister gathered the papers without comment and slid them into a folder. She did not offer an explanation. I did not ask for one. The room felt colder than the hallway behind me. That was how the visit started. My father appeared in the doorway a moment later. He looked tired but not ill. He gave me a brief nod and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. We moved to the kitchen as if nothing unusual had happened. My mother and my sister followed. The folder stayed on the table in the sitting room. Breakfast the next morning was supposed to be simple. My Aunt Alice had driven in from the other side of town, and my cousin Peyton was already at the table when I came downstairs. My sister's husband Jasper stood at the counter pouring orange juice. My mother had set out the good china without saying why. The table held 8 places even though only 7 of us were there. The conversation began with small things. My aunt asked about my work in Milwaukee. I answered without detail. My cousin mentioned a new restaurant downtown. My sister nodded and said the name of the place as if she had already been. My mother listened without speaking. Her eyes moved from face to face like she was taking inventory. Then my sister brought up the lake house. She said the family should plan a weekend there before the weather turned. She looked at my mother when she said it. My mother nodded once, the same small motion she used when she agreed with something she had already decided. My aunt said it sounded nice. My cousin asked who would be paying for the groceries and the gas this time. The question hung in the air for a second too long. My mother set her cup down. She did not raise her voice. She said the family had always shared expenses according to who could afford it. She did not look at me when she spoke. My sister added that some people had more flexibility in their schedules than others. She smiled when she said it. I kept my hands around my own cup. The coffee had gone cold. My cousin glanced at me and then looked away. My aunt stirred her eggs without comment. Jasper reached for the butter and did not meet anyone's eyes. The only sound for a moment was the scrape of a knife against toast. My mother continued. She said maintaining the lake house was important for the family's standing. People noticed when a property sat empty. She said it reflected on all of us. My sister agreed without hesitation. She said some of us needed to remember that the family name still mattered in certain circles. I set my cup down. The sound was soft against the saucer. I asked how the expenses were being divided this year. I kept my voice even. My mother answered that the arrangement had not changed. My sister said the same thing in different words. Neither of them offered numbers. My aunt finally spoke. She asked whether the trust still covered the property taxes. My mother said the trust was not. The point. The point was keeping the place presentable. My sister added that some people treated family obligations like optional line items on a budget. The words landed without force. They did not need force. Everyone at the table understood who the sentence was meant for. I stood up. I carried my plate to the sink and rinsed it. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway. The door to the sitting room was still open. The folder from the night before sat on the low table where my sister had left it. I did not touch it. I kept walking until I reached the back porch. The air outside was cool for late summer. I stood with my hands in my pockets and watched the neighbor's yard. Lucille Harding was watering her roses. She raised one hand when she saw me. I raised mine in return. Neither of us spoke. Inside the house someone laughed. The sound was short and controlled. It could have been my sister. It could have been my mother. I did not go back in to find out. Later that afternoon Bernard Holt arrived. He was the accountant who had handled the family accounts for as long as I could remember. My mother had asked him to stop by to review some paperwork. She introduced him to the room as if he were a guest rather than someone who had known all of us since we were children. He shook my hand and asked how Milwaukee was treating me. I said it was fine. He nodded and followed my mother into the sitting room. The door closed behind them. My sister stayed in the kitchen with my aunt and cousin. I heard their voices through the wall but could not make out the words. I sat on the front steps with a glass of water. The afternoon light made the white columns look softer than they were. Across the street a car drove past without slowing. I thought about driving back to Milwaukee before dinner. I thought about staying and saying nothing for the rest of the weekend. Both options felt equally distant. My phone rang once. I let it go to voicemail. When I checked it later, the message was from my sister. She had left it while I was on the porch. The recording was short. She said she hoped I understood that the lake house conversation had not been personal. She said some things had to be said for the sake of the family. She said she would see me at dinner. I deleted the message without replying. That evening my father asked if I was planning to stay the full weekend. I told him I had not decided. He nodded as if that were an answer. My mother did not ask. My sister did not look at me when she passed the potatoes. After the meal I helped clear the table. My aunt tried to start a conversation about a book she was reading. I answered when it was required. My cousin offered to help with the dishes. I said I had it. The kitchen emptied. I stood at the sink with the water running and let the sound fill the room. Outside the window Lucille Harding's porch light came on. She stepped outside with a small dog on a leash. She glanced toward our house. I lifted one hand again. She lifted hers. The gesture was brief. Neither of us smiled. I finished the dishes and dried my hands on a towel that had been in the drawer since I was a child. The house was quiet. My mother and my sister were in the sitting room again. The door was closed this time. I could hear the low murmur of their voices but not the words. I walked upstairs to the room that had once been mine. The bed was made. The curtains were drawn. I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the closed door. The house settled around me the way it always had. Nothing had changed and everything had changed in the same moment. I did not know yet what I would do in the morning. I only knew that the version of the weekend I had expected had already ended. The next morning the house was already awake when I came downstairs. My mother stood at the stove turning eggs in a cast-iron skillet. My sister sat at the table with her phone face down beside her plate. Neither of them looked up when I entered the room. My father was already in his chair, reading the newspaper without turning the pages. I poured coffee and sat across from my sister. The steam rose between us. My mother brought the skillet to the table and served the eggs without asking who wanted them. She placed the last portion on my plate and returned the skillet to the stove. The motion was precise. She did not sit down. She said the lake house needed new siding before winter. She said the cost would be shared the way it always had been. She looked at my sister when she spoke. My sister nodded and said the contractor she had found could start next month. She did not mention numbers. She did not look at me. My Aunt Alice came in from the guest room and took the seat beside my father. She asked if anyone had checked the weather for the weekend. My cousin Peyton followed a minute later and sat at the end of the table. My sister's husband Jasper poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. The room held the same 7 people from the day before, yet the air felt tighter. My mother returned to the table and folded her hands. She said maintaining the property was not only about comfort. It was about what people saw when they drove past. She said the family had a name in this city and that name required upkeep. Her voice stayed level. She might have been discussing the weather. My sister added that some contributions mattered more than others. She stirred her coffee without lifting the spoon. She said timing was important and that not everyone could be expected to understand the full picture. The sentence landed softly. No one at the table asked her to explain it. I set my fork down. The sound was small against the plate. I asked whether the trust documents still listed all 4 of us as equal beneficiaries. The question was simple. I kept my tone flat. My mother's eyes moved to my face for the first time that morning. She said the trust was not the issue. The issue was responsibility. My sister said some people preferred to ask questions rather than offer solutions. She smiled when she said it, the same small smile she had used the evening before. My aunt looked from my mother to me and back again. She did not speak. My cousin kept his eyes on his plate. Jasper turned the faucet on and let the water run longer than necessary. The sound filled the space where answers should have been. My mother stood. She said Bernard Holt would be stopping by again that afternoon to go over the quarterly statements. She said it would be helpful if everyone were present. She did not wait for agreement. She carried her plate to the sink and left the room. The rest of us finished the meal in near silence. When the table was cleared, my sister took her phone into the hallway. I heard the low sound of her voice but could not distinguish the words. She returned a few minutes later and said she had to run an errand. She did not say where. She did not invite anyone to join her. I stayed in the kitchen with my aunt and cousin. My aunt washed the remaining dishes by hand even though the dishwasher was empty. She asked whether I had plans for the rest of the day. I said I did not. She nodded and handed me a towel. We worked without speaking for several minutes. My cousin finally broke the quiet. He said the lake house conversation had felt heavier than usual. He did not look at me when he said it. I folded the towel and placed it on the counter. I told him some conversations were meant to feel that way. He did not ask what I meant. Bernard Holt arrived at 2 o'clock. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the same gray suit he had worn the day before. My mother met him at the door and led him into the sitting room. She asked my sister and me to join them. My father stayed in the kitchen with my aunt. The door to the sitting room closed behind the 4 of us. Bernard opened the briefcase on the low table. He removed a folder and set it between us. He said he had pulled the most recent statements for the family accounts and the trust that covered the lake house. He said there were a few line items that needed clarification before the next quarter. His voice was professional. He might have been speaking to strangers. My mother asked him to begin. Bernard turned the first page. He pointed to a series of transfers that had moved money from the main trust into a separate account labeled for maintenance. The amounts were larger than I remembered from previous years. He said the transfers had been authorized by 2 of the trustees. He did not name them. My sister leaned forward. She said the maintenance account had been necessary for the siding project and for keeping the property presentable. She said the family could not afford to let standards slip. My mother nodded once. She did not add anything. I asked to see the full list of transfers from the past 18 months. Bernard hesitated for half a second before he turned the page. The numbers were listed in neat columns. Several entries showed amounts moved to cover events and memberships that had nothing to do with the lake house itself. One line read annual gala sponsorship. Another read club renewal. None of them carried my name or my father's. My mother said the family had always supported local institutions. She said those contributions protected the name. My sister said some people benefited from the name without ever having to protect it. She spoke without looking at me. Bernard closed the folder. He said he would prepare a summary and send it to all 4 trustees by the end of the week. He stood and shook my mother's hand. He nodded to my sister. When he reached me, he paused. He said it was good to see me again. His voice was the same professional tone he had used with the others, yet the pause lasted a fraction longer than necessary. He left without another word. My mother and my sister remained in the sitting room after he was gone. I walked into the kitchen. My father was still at the table with the newspaper. My aunt was drying the last of the glasses. She asked if everything had gone all right. I said Bernard had brought the statements. She nodded and did not ask for details. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped onto the back porch before I checked it. The message was from my sister. She had sent it while I was still in the sitting room. The text was short. It said she hoped I understood that the numbers were not the whole story. It said some decisions had to be made quietly to protect everyone. I deleted the message and put the phone back in my pocket. Lucille Harding was in her yard. Again, this time pulling weeds from the border of her rose bed. She looked up when she saw me on the porch. She raised one hand. I raised mine. The gesture was the same as the day before. Neither of us crossed the space between the houses. Inside, someone turned on the television in the living room. The sound was low. I could not tell whether it was my mother or my sister who had chosen the channel. I stayed on the porch until the light began to change. The air grew cooler. I thought about the folder Bernard had left behind and the transfers that did not match what I had been told for years. I did not go back inside right away. I watched Lucille finish her weeding and carry the small pile of pulled plants to the curb. She moved slowly. When she reached her porch, she turned once more toward our house. She did not wave this time. She only looked. Then she went inside and closed the door. The house behind me was quiet again. I could hear the low murmur of the television and, beneath it, the sound of my mother's voice speaking to my sister. I could not make out the words. I did not need to. The shape of the conversation was already familiar. I stayed where I was until the street lights came on. Then I went back inside. The folder was no longer on the low table in the sitting room. Someone had moved it. I did not ask where it had gone. The folder had disappeared by the time I came downstairs the next morning. My mother was already in the kitchen making coffee. My sister sat at the table with her phone in her hand, scrolling without speaking. My father read the same section of the newspaper he had read the day before. The house felt smaller than it had on Friday. I poured a cup and stood at the counter. My mother asked if I planned to stay through Sunday. I said I had not decided. She nodded as if the answer did not matter and returned to the stove. My sister set her phone face down and said the contractor for the lake house siding wanted a deposit by the end of the week. She looked at my mother when she spoke. My Aunt Alice came in and sat beside my father. She asked whether anyone had heard from Bernard after he left. My mother said he would send the summary as promised. My sister added that some questions were better left for private conversations. The sentence was directed at the table but landed on me. Breakfast passed with the same careful spacing of words that had marked every meal since I arrived. My cousin Peyton joined late and ate quickly. My sister's husband Jasper cleared plates without being asked. When the table was empty, my mother said she wanted everyone in the sitting room at 11. She said Bernard had forwarded a few items that required discussion. She did not say what the items were. At 11 the 7 of us gathered again. Bernard was not there. My mother held a single printed page. She said the transfers from the trust had been reviewed and everything was in order. She said the family could move forward with the siding project without further delay. My sister agreed before anyone else could speak. I asked to see the page. My mother handed it to me without comment. The numbers matched what Bernard had shown the day before. Several lines still listed payments for events and memberships that had nothing to do with the lake house. I set the page on the low table between us. My sister picked it up and folded it once. She said the family had always handled its own matters without outside interference. She said some people preferred to treat every number as a personal accusation. My mother nodded. She said the name still carried weight in Madison and that weight required protection. Her voice stayed even. She might have been reading from a script she had written years ago. My aunt cleared her throat. She asked whether the trust still required all 4 signatures for large transfers. My mother said the current arrangement had worked for decades. My sister said changing it now would only create unnecessary complications. My cousin looked at the folded page in my sister's hand and then at me. He did not speak. My mother stood. She said the conversation was finished. She said anyone who wanted to remain part of the family's decisions would need to accept that some matters stayed inside the house. She looked at me when she said the last sentence. Then she left the room. The others followed slowly. My aunt touched my arm as she passed but did not speak. My cousin gave a small nod that could have meant anything. My sister stayed behind for a moment. She said she hoped I would not make the rest of the weekend difficult. She said our mother had enough to manage without additional questions. Then she left as well. I remained in the sitting room. The printed page lay on the table where my sister had placed it. I picked it up and read the lines again. The amounts were not large enough to bankrupt anyone. They were steady, repeated, and always justified under the same heading of family standing. I folded the page and put it in my pocket. My phone rang in the kitchen where I had left it charging. I walked in to answer. The call had already gone to voicemail. I pressed play without thinking and the speaker turned on. My sister's voice filled the room before I could lower the volume. She was speaking to our mother. The recording was from the night before. She said Amelia had seen the statements and was asking about the gala payments. She said Amelia would probably bring it up at breakfast. She said they should keep the answers simple and remind her that the family name came first. My mother's reply was short. She said Amelia had always been better at noticing numbers than at understanding what the numbers protected. The message ended. I stopped the playback. The kitchen was empty. I did not know how long the message had been on the phone or why it had played through the speaker. I deleted it without saving. My aunt appeared in the doorway a minute later. She asked if everything was all right. I said the phone had played an old message by accident. She nodded and did not ask to hear it. She said my mother and sister were on the front porch talking about the contractor again. She said my cousin had gone for a walk. She asked if I wanted company. I said I was fine. I stepped outside through the back door. Lucille Harding was in her yard again, this time sweeping the walkway. She looked up when she saw me. She set the broom against the porch railing and walked to the low fence that separated the properties. She said she had heard raised voices the day Bernard came. She said she had not meant to listen but the windows had been open. She said my mother and sister had been discussing how to answer questions about the trust without giving direct answers. She said they had used the word appearances several times. Her voice was quiet. She did not apologize for speaking. I thanked her for telling me. She nodded once and returned to her sweeping. She did not look back. I stayed by the fence for another minute. The street was quiet. A car passed without slowing. I turned and went back inside. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly. My mother and sister stayed on the porch until the light changed. My father watched television in the living room. My aunt read in the guest room. My cousin returned from his walk and sat on the front steps with his phone. No one mentioned the message or the page in my pocket. At dinner, my mother served the meal without comment on the earlier conversation. My sister passed the bread and said the weather looked good for the drive back to Milwaukee. She did not ask when I was leaving. My aunt asked if I would be coming back for the holidays. I said I did not know yet. My mother did not look up from her plate. After the meal, I helped clear the table. My sister stood at the sink rinsing plates. She said the lake house weekend would be good for everyone. She said it would remind us why the family kept certain traditions. I dried the last glass and placed it in the cabinet. I said I would not be joining the lake house plans this year. She turned the water off and looked at me. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. My mother came into the kitchen then. She asked what we were discussing. My sister said I had decided not to come to the lake house. My mother nodded. She said the decision was mine to make. She said the family would manage without me. Her voice carried no anger. It carried no invitation to change my mind. I went upstairs and packed the bag I had brought on Friday. The room looked the same as it had when I arrived. I carried the bag down and set it by the front door. My father came out of the living room. He asked if I was driving back tonight. I said yes. He nodded and said the roads should be clear. He did not ask why I was leaving early. My mother and sister stood in the hallway. My sister said she hoped I would think about what had been said over the weekend. My mother said some choices carried longer consequences than people expected. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a reason to stay. I picked up the bag. I said goodbye to my aunt and cousin, who had come to the doorway. My aunt touched my arm again. My cousin said to drive safely. I nodded to both of them. I did not look at my mother or my sister when I opened the door. Lucille Harding's porch light was on. She stood on her steps with the small dog at her feet. She raised one hand as I walked to my car. I raised mine in return. The gesture was the same as it had been all weekend. Neither of us crossed the grass between the houses. I drove out of Madison without stopping. The highway was empty in both directions. I did not turn on the radio. I thought about the folder that had disappeared, the page with the transfers, and the message that had played on speaker. I thought about my mother's voice when she said the family would manage without me. I thought about the spontaneous weekends that would no longer happen without explanation or invitation. The choice had been quiet. It had not required a raised voice or a final scene. It had required only the decision to stop returning to rooms where the numbers and the name always came before the people in them. My mother would continue to protect the image she had built. My sister would continue to help her do it. The house on the edge of the historic district would remain exactly as it had always been. I reached Milwaukee after midnight. I carried my bag into the apartment and set it by the door. The rooms were dark and still. I did not turn on the lights. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the quiet that belonged only to me. Choosing myself had not felt like victory. It had felt like the end of a long argument I had never been allowed to finish. The cost was the loss of the visits that had once arrived without warning and the conversations that had once been possible before the papers came out. My mother remained where she had always been, inside the house that protected the name. I remained outside it. That was the trade. I had made it without drama and without the hope that anything would change on the other side of the fence. The courage was not in the leaving. The courage was in accepting that the leaving would be permanent and that no one in the house would call it anything other than my own decision. Thank you for listening to my story. If this kind of quiet boundary resonates with you, comment freedom if you walked away.